Hi all. To help me grow my channel, please subscribe. The mist clings to the thatch, thick and heavy, swallowing the edges of the world. It is the kind of cold that settles deep into the marrow, dampening sound until the only thing left is the rhythmic strike of boots against frozen mud, somewhere behind the shroud. The sun bleeds over the horizon, a thin, pale smear of light that offers no warmth. My name is Thomas. I was born in 1486 in a village that no longer exists on any map. It was erased by time, pulled down into the earth, yet I stand here as a witness to what was lost. I am an old man now, a ghost of that forgotten time, watching the world shift beyond recognition. You look for history in the stories of kings and the rise of empires, but you are looking in the wrong place. History is not written in ink on parchment. It is built by the quiet, stubborn persistence of those who wake before the dawn to face the winter. I offer you a window into a single day, not of grand battles, but of survival in the dirt. Listen closely, for the silence of that time has much to say. Survival was not a narrative of triumph. It was a cycle of repetitive, unyielding labor. Every day began with a battle against the land that refused to yield its bounty without a fight. We did not live in a storybook. We lived in the dirt, our fingernails permanently stained with the soil we turned and the roots we pulled. There was no grandeur in the rhythm of our days. It was the grind of the millstone, the ache in the lower back, and the constant, gnawing anxiety that the harvest might fail. We worked until our muscles burned, moving in long, silent lines across the fields. If a tool broke, we repaired it, because there was no replacement. If a roof leaked, we patched it with whatever was at hand. We were a tangle of fragile lives, held together by necessity and proximity. If a barn collapsed under the weight of a winter storm, the neighbors appeared before the dust settled, not out of noble intent, but because the survival of one was tied to the survival of all. We were bound to the next row of wheat, the next season, and the next meal. The world outside the village was a myth. Here, reality was measured in yield, labor, and the stubborn refusal to stop. The transition from the depths of sleep to the waking world was never gentle. It began with the sound of the wind rattling the frame of the house, a thin, sharp whistling that sliced through the quiet of the room. We did not wake to the sun. We woke to the encroaching dark that seemed to press inward from the walls. I stayed still for a moment, listening to the shallow, synchronized breathing of my family huddled together. The air in the room was stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth and stale breath. I moved to sit up, and the first thing that hit me was the floor. It was not just cold, it was biting, a relentless, icy hardness that seeped instantly through my skin. Every muscle in my body protested the movement, stiff and aching from the day before. I pressed my palms flat against the boards, feeling the rough texture and the deep chill of the wood. There was no softness here, no cushion against the reality of the morning. I sat in the dark, shivering, waiting for the blood to flow back into my limbs. The house felt hollow, a fragile shell against the vast, freezing night that still held the world in its grip. I took a breath, held it, and waited for the next step. I pushed myself up from the freezing floor and moved toward the center of the room. The hearth remained a dark, hollow pit, holding only the gray remains of last night's fire. I knelt on the uneven stone, the grit pressing into my knees. My fingers reached into the pile, sifting through the cold. Powdery ash to find the center. There, buried deep, a single, faint glow pulsed like a dying heart. I leaned in, shielding the small light with my hands to keep the draft away. I blew, gently at first, then harder, watching as the gray film lifted to reveal a vibrant, cherry-red core. I fed it a splinter of dry wood. Nothing. I tried again, my breath steady, rhythmic, focused entirely on that singular point of heat. A tiny wisp of smoke curled upward, then a crackle broke the silence. A flame licked at the edge of the wood, hesitant, then bolder. It spread, consuming the tinder, casting a flickering orange light that pushed the shadows back against the walls. The air around the hearth began to soften. I held my hands over the rising heat, watching the life bloom in the hearth. A small, hard-won victory against the relentless morning chill. The warmth from the hearth was a luxury I could not linger in for long. I turned away, the biting air rushing in to reclaim the space behind me. I reached for the stack kept near the wall. The material was heavy, resisting my grip with a stubborn, frozen rigidity. As I pulled the weight over my shoulders, the fibers scratched against my skin, rough and unyielding. It held the deep, pervasive scent of the hearth, a lingering ghost of the wood smoke that defined our winter nights. I moved my hand across the surface, my fingers catching on the uneven ridges of the repairs. Each bump was a map of effort. I traced the tight, precise rows of stitches that held the fraying edges together. They were not merely repairs. They were the physical evidence of hours spent by a single candle, pulling thread through stubborn weave to keep the cold at bay. I pressed my palm against the dense, knotted surface, feeling the strength of the work. There was a quiet weight to this process, a reminder that every thread was a deliberate act of protection. The material felt less like a covering and more like a second, hardened skin, constructed to withstand the relentless pressure of the world outside our door. We gathered at the wooden table, the surface scarred by years of use. My father placed the loaf down with a dull thud. It was dense, dark, and hard as stone. I gripped the crust, my thumbs digging into the rough texture, and pulled. It resisted, then gave way with a dry, snapping sound. Inside, the crumb was coarse, tasting of the soil and the long, slow grind of the mill. Beside it sat a bowl of pottage. I dipped my spoon into the thick, grayish broth, watching the steam rise in thin, curling ribbons. The surface shimmered with the oils of boiled roots, and the dark, bitter tang of kale pulled from the frost-hardened garden. I lifted the spoon to my mouth, the heat blooming against my tongue, grounding me in the reality of the morning. Every bite required effort to chew, a rhythmic grinding that echoed the labor we would soon face in the fields. This food was not merely sustenance, it was the harvested result of our own sweat. The garden's reluctant surrender transformed into the energy required to survive another day. I finished the last of the broth, scraping the bottom of the bowl, feeling the weight of the meal settle in my stomach as the final, necessary preparation for the work ahead. The morning air bit into our lungs as we reached the perimeter of the field. My father gripped the leather leads, his knuckles white against the dark, weathered hide. The oxen stood motionless, their heavy breath pluming into the gray sky, waiting for the command. He stepped forward, the wooden frame of the plow creaking as he positioned it. With a sharp tug, the beasts leaned into the harness, their muscles bunching under the strain. The blade sank into the earth, cutting through the topsoil with a low, agonizing groan of timber against stone. Suddenly, the plow jerked to a violent halt. A hidden root had snagged the tip. My father braced his boots against the churned mud, leaning his entire weight into the handle, shouting a guttural command to the animals. The oxen surged, their hooves digging deep, and with a wet, tearing sound, the earth gave way. The blade resumed its steady, relentless path, carving a deep, dark furrow across the landscape. We followed in the wake of the iron, the scent of turned soil rising sharply around us. The rhythm of the work was established, the pull, the groan of the wood, and the steady slide of earth being folded over to prepare for the coming season. We fell into line, a row of bodies bent at the waist, moving in a slow, grinding procession across the field. My back became a taut wire of tension, each step forward demanding a conscious effort to keep pace with the others. The sun climbed higher, baking the moisture from the air, but the work did not pause. We moved as one organism, our movements dictated by the necessity of the harvest. I watched the person ahead of me, their shoulders rising and falling with the same rhythmic, labored cadence as my own. Every time we reached the end of the row, we would straighten, our spines protesting with sharp, jagged twinges, only to turn and begin the trek back across the field. There was no conversation. Words were a waste of breath better spent on the task. We were a collective force of muscle and bone, driven by the knowledge that the winter would not wait for our fatigue. A bead of sweat stung my eye, but I did not reach up to wipe it away. My hands were occupied. gripping the tools until my knuckles throbbed. We were linked by this shared exhaustion, a silent pact of perseverance where the only goal was the next handful of grain, and the next, until the field lay bare behind us. The field faded behind me as I reached the edge of the stream. Here, the air changed, heavy with the scent of damp moss and pulverized grain. I walked to the edge of the mill house, my boots sinking into the wet mud. The water hit the wooden paddles with a rhythmic, thunderous impact, forcing the great wheel to turn. Inside, the massive stones were locked in their eternal, circular dance. I placed my palm against the exterior wall, feeling the deep, low-frequency hum vibrating through the timber and into my own bones. It was a pulse that resonated through the entire village. Each revolution of the stones meant another handful of flour, another day of sustenance, another barrier against the coming frost. I watched the water churn, white foam bubbling as it rushed past the sluice gate. The grinding sound was absolute, drowning out the birds and the wind. It was the mechanical heartbeat of our existence. I stayed there for a long moment, leaning into the vibration, letting the steady, relentless motion anchor me. The stones did not tire, they did not hunger, they simply worked, grinding the raw harvest into the lifeblood of our homes, turning the labor of our aching backs into the very bread that kept us upright. A sound like a lightning strike shattered the afternoon calm. I turned toward the village square just as the main beam of the old barn buckled, showering the lane in dust and splintered wood. There was no hesitation. Within seconds, men were running from the fields, abandoning their tools, while others emerged from the houses with hammers, iron nails, and heavy ropes. We did not wait for orders or leaders. We formed a human chain, passing heavy timber hand to hand, our muscles locking to hold the sagging frame in place while the foundations were shored up. The air was filled with the sharp ring of iron hitting iron and the guttural grunts of men straining against the weight of the roof. My shoulder burned against a thick oak support, the rough bark digging into my skin as I braced my weight. Beside me, a neighbor I barely knew gripped the same beam, his face beaded with sweat, his eyes fixed on the shifting rafters. We moved as one, anticipating each other's shifts, balancing the precarious load until the final peg was driven home. As the structure settled, the tension drained out of the air, replaced by the collective breath of 20 men. We did not cheer. We simply nodded, wiped our palms, and turned back to the work that remained, the barn now solid against the sky once more. The sun dipped low, casting long, bruised shadows across the village, but the warmth of the day had vanished. I returned home to find the hearth cold and the usual evening preparations stalled. My sister sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her breathing shallow and ragged. I touched her forehead. It burned, radiating a heat that felt entirely unnatural against the cooling air of the room. She did not look up when I spoke her name. The sudden stillness in the house was sharper than the noise of any collapsing barn. My father paced the small space, his hands gripping his knees, unable to offer a remedy. We sent for Widow Alice. She arrived as the last light faded, moving with a grim, practiced efficiency that told us she had seen the shadow before. She carried a bundle of dried herbs, their pungent, earthy scent filling the room and masking the smell of stale air. She knelt by my sister, her fingers working with a steady, clinical focus as she crushed the leaves into a wooden bowl. She poured hot water, the steam rising in thin, ghostly ribbons. She looked at us, her expression unreadable, and began to stir the bitter brew. The invisible threat had crossed our threshold, and for the first time, our collective strength felt like nothing against the encroaching dark. The candle flickered, casting long, dancing fingers against the walls as we settled into the long vigil. Time stopped. There was only the rhythmic, uneven rasp of my sister's breathing. Each inhale a struggle that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the room. My father sat on a three-legged stool, his hands locked together so tightly his knuckles turned white. He did not move. He did not speak. I knelt beside the straw mattress, pressing a damp cloth to her brow, but the heat was a furnace that dried the linen in moments. She let out a low, guttural moan, her body arching against the coarse bedding as a tremor seized her. I reached for the cup of bitter tea, trying to coax a swallow past her lips, but her jaw remained locked, her teeth clenched against the world. Nothing entered. Nothing changed. The wind outside began to howl, rattling the oiled linen of the window frame, yet inside, the silence was heavier. We watched the shadows crawl across the floor, measuring the passage of the night by the shortening of the candle stub. Every flicker of her eyelids brought a surge of hope, only to be crushed when her gaze remained fixed on the rafters, seeing something we could not. We were trapped in a circle of candlelight, waiting for a dawn that felt impossibly far away. The candle burned down to a pool of wax, the flame guttering in the final draft of the night. Then, the rasping stopped. It did not fade. It cut out, leaving a void where the sound of life had anchored us for hours. I waited for the next inhale. It never came. I leaned closer, my ear inches from her lips, but the air remained perfectly still. No warmth touched my skin. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point in her neck. Nothing. The house, usually alive with the creak of timber and the wind outside, seemed to hold its own breath in response. My father stood up, his stool scraping harshly against the packed earth floor, yet the sound died instantly, swallowed by the weight of the room. He looked at me, then at the still form on the mattress, his face hardening into a mask of stone. Widow Alice stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and she closed my sister's eyes with a thumb. The silence was not empty. It was heavy. It pressed against my chest, a physical presence that turned the air cold and thin. In that moment, the world of my youth fractured. The path forward disappeared, leaving only the ringing in my ears and the absolute, terrifying quiet of a life extinguished. I walked outside before the sun hit the thatch. The air was sharp, smelling of damp soil and frost. My boots crunched over the frozen garden path, the only sound in a world that refused to acknowledge the void left behind. Father was already at the shed, sharpening the iron blade of the plow. The rhythmic rasp of stone against metal echoed across the yard. He did not look up when I approached. He did not ask for help, but he pushed the heavy wooden handle toward me. Expecting the weight, I took it. My muscles burned as I dragged the plow into the field, the metal biting deep into the stubborn, unyielding earth. I turned the soil, row after row, forcing my body into the familiar, agonizing motion of the harvest. A hawk circled high above, silent and watchful. It did not care that the house behind us had fallen quiet. The sun bled over the horizon, casting a harsh, orange light that revealed every stone, every clump of dirt, every scar on the land. I gripped the wooden frame until my knuckles ached, focusing only on the next inch of soil to be turned, drowning the memory of the silence and the physical toll of the work. The heavy oak doors groaned as we pushed them open, moving from the biting wind into the stagnant, incense-thick air of the church. My father crossed himself, his fingers leaving streaks of field dirt on his forehead. We knelt on the uneven flagstones, the cold seeping through our trousers instantly. The space was hollow, a stone shell that swallowed the sound of our ragged breathing. At the altar, the candles flickered, their flames thin and pale against the gloom. Then, the priest began. The Latin words did not reach me as meaning, but as a vibration. They rolled off the vaulted ceiling, deep and resonant, filling the empty gaps where my grief had been. I watched the dust motes dance in a single shaft of light filtering from high above. The rhythm of the chanting pulled at my attention, forcing my focus away from the ache in my back and the memory of the silent house. My father bowed his head, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. For a moment, the world outside the plow, the stubborn soil, the hunger ceased to exist. There was only the sound, the rising and falling of the voices, and the strange, thin peace of being held within the stone walls. The chanting intensified, the voices weaving together into a singular, unwavering wall of sound. It pushed against the damp cold of the stone, demanding a place for our sorrow within the vast architecture of the heavens. I looked toward the front row. Widow Alice was there, her lips moving in time with the Latin, her eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar. Beside her, the miller stood with his head tilted back, his neck corded with tension. We were a broken assembly of farmers and laborers, yet in this cadence, our scattered lives felt tethered to something that did not shift with the seasons. The priest raised his hands, the sleeves falling back to reveal skin mapped by age and labor. He spoke of a kingdom beyond the reach of hunger, a place where the wheat did not fail, and the heavy, black soil offered no resistance. I felt the pressure in my chest loosen. It was not a cure for the silence in our home, but it was a frame for it. We were not merely casualties of a cold earth. We were part of a grander, unseen pattern. As the final note faded into the rafters, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full. We stood, the movement slow and stiff, and prepared to carry the weight of the coming winter back out into the light. We walked back from the church as the horizon bled its last bit of color. The fields were already deep in shadow, the furrows turning into dark, jagged lines that stretched toward the edge of the world. By the time we reached the threshold, the wind had sharpened, whistling through the gaps in the thatch. I pushed the door open, letting the smell of damp earth and wood smoke wash over me. The hearth was low. I knelt, raking through the gray ash to find the glowing core, feeding it small, dry twigs until the flames licked upward again. My father sat heavily on the bench, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the day etched into his posture. We moved closer to the heat. There was no space between us now. We sat shoulder to shoulder, the firelight flickering against our faces, casting long, dancing shadows that climbed the walls. Outside, the wind rattled the oiled linen of the window, a persistent, hollow sound that reminded us of the vast, freezing dark waiting just beyond the wood. We did not speak. We sat in the amber glow, our bodies pressed together, sharing the only warmth we possessed. It was our shield, our boundary, and the final barrier against the night. The fire crackled, casting a steady pulse of light that held the shadows at bay. But my mind drifted past the walls of our home. Rumors traveled on the wind like smoke. They spoke of massive ships with sails like clouds, crossing oceans that had no end. Scholars in distant cities were mapping the stars, rearranging the heavens to fit new theories, daring to question the very foundation of the world. It felt like a different universe. While they looked to the horizon, we looked to the ground. Their discoveries were as distant as the moon, while the needs of our field were immediate, biting, and absolute. We knew nothing of empires or the shifting patterns of the stars. We knew only the next row of wheat and the depth of the furrow. The earth demanded a constant, physical dialogue that left no room for the grand questions of kings. I watched my father stir the coals, his hands thick and scarred, and realized that our life was defined by this narrow, stubborn cycle. The world was expanding, twisting into shapes we could not imagine, yet we remained anchored to the soil. We were the silent gears in a machine we would never see. Everything else was just a whisper in the dark. The cycles of the wheat have long since ended for me. I sit now in a world that has shifted its axis, a place where the paths I once walked are buried beneath stone and steel. I am a ghost of that forgotten time, an old man tethered to memories that no longer hold weight in the eyes of the living. I look at the horizon and see cities that scrape the clouds, lit by fires that never fade. The silence of my village, the smell of the damp thatch, the rhythm of the mill, it is all gone, scrubbed away by the relentless march of centuries. I try to speak of the earth, of the strain in the back and the grit under the fingernails, but the words fall flat against the roar of the present. I am the last archive of a life lived in the dirt. I walk through these modern streets, and I see nothing of the world I helped build. It is a strange, hollow existence, to be the only one who remembers the weight of the plow and the cold bite of the morning wind. I watch the people pass, blind to the foundation beneath their feet, and I wait, a silent witness to a history that the world has chosen to outrun. History is not written by kings alone. That is the lie the powerful tell to keep their names etched in stone. The truth is found in the dirt, in the calloused hands that grip the plow until the skin split, and in the silent prayers whispered against the encroaching winter. It is built by those who woke before the dawn, not for glory, but for the next meal. I look at my own hands, scarred and weathered, and I see the map of that survival. It was a fierce, quiet love that kept us tethered to the land when the world offered nothing but coal. We were the foundation upon which every monument was raised, the silent pulse beneath the noise of empires. My life was small, measured in rows of wheat and the steady rhythm of the seasons. Yet it was not empty. It was a defiance. To wake in the dark, to endure the frost, to labor without recognition, that is the act of creation. The world may have forgotten the village, but the earth remembers the weight of our steps. History is not a record of rulers. It is the sum of every hand that reached for the light before the sun rose. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me grow. Thanks.